and I hope you're going to enjoy this evening. I'm really excited about tonight. So we have Lara Buchanan, who's going to be helping us think through this question from her own experience and expertise on is the Bible pro-women? Lara is an itinerant speaker with RZIM, and we'll talk about that and what in the world is that in just a second. She holds degrees in history, English literature, and a PGCE from the University of Cape Town, as well as a certificate in theology from Oxford University, and in apologetics, Christian apologetics from the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. And she's spoken in many different contexts around the world. And I'm personally honored to call her friend. Lara, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining.
It's a pleasure. It's so nice to be with you guys, and can't see any of you, but hi.
And Lara, you're from South Africa. Are you enjoying this weather at the moment then?
I am. Although, as I was saying earlier, I'm struggling. I'm not by the sea as you guys are, and I'm definitely missing the ocean. But
yeah.
I feel very at home.
Longing for the day when you can have a braai with lots of friends. Yeah. So you were a teacher, I think that's right, and now an itinerant speaker with RZIM or RZIM. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I initially started out my kind of professional life as a secondary school teacher. I taught history and English literature. And I was always passionate about understanding ideas. I think that's actually why I was drawn to English literature, because of the kind of depth that's often communicated in the ideas that humans think of, through story. And then in history, I kind of was drawn to history because I feel like you just get this whole sweep of the, I guess, progression that humanity's gone on in terms of what we care about, and I'm fascinated by humans, and I think so. I loved doing that. Came to England initially as a history teacher, taught in London for 3 years. If there are any teachers out there, I've never had the pain of online teaching, but I've definitely. Experienced the highs and lows, I would say, of teaching. I did love it, but it increasingly just felt myself drawn to this, really wanting to home in on the ideas, the big ideas. That's kind of why I was drawn to those subjects, and then found Oxford ran this theology course that was twinned with this apologetics, which is essentially kind of looking at the questions and the answers that are in Christian theology. So I ended up doing that, and that's what I do now. So I basically just study big questions of life and go around having interesting conversations like the one hopefully we'll have tonight.
And I hope you don't mind me asking this, but when you were a teacher, you once had to wear a helmet or something. Is that right?
Yeah, that was definitely when I say the highs and lows, that was one of the lows. No, I was in a classroom where, oh gosh, it's a bit of a story. There was actually just a bit of there were one or two really violent kids, and basically I had all sorts of crazy things were happening, and I was such a new teacher that I didn't get my head around what I should be doing, and all I could think was to at least wear a helmet for safety. So I did a lesson on I don't know how like safety, and then I just kept the helmet on the whole time.
Wow.
Very bizarre story.
A bicycle helmet.
Yeah, I was better than nothing.
Nice. Just imagining a lecturer with a bicycle helmet at the front. That's great. So you're now, you speak, you travel around the world. You mentioned this area of kind of apologetics. Tell us just a bit about what that's like and what you do.
Yeah, so it's basically the organization is set up by a group of people, mainly academics. I'm not haven't gone down the academic route myself, but I love academia, and the majority of the people in the organization are academics who have been passionate about thinking about, I guess, what especially Christians believe, but about faith in general, about how the world of faith and ideas and philosophy cohere with academia and the intellect. And Christianity has a long and rich tradition of being a place where you can bring your questions. Christianity and I guess our organization is really kind of predicated on this idea that the God of the universe welcomes our questions, our doubts and questions are inherent actually in faith. Anything that we end up having faith in, or in another way of thinking of is having trust in, has to be built on a genuine, having seen genuine truths in it that we're really convinced by. You can't just, like, well, that, because Christianity would say that true faith isn't just a kind of wish fulfillment, a Freudian kind of idea of like just hoping against hope, even though there's no evidence that that particular belief system is actually true. Christianity is saying that actually this is actually true, and just like any other truth, you can scrutinize it from different angles. And so our organization just exists to say, just as Christians have for centuries, not always very well, and often we don't do this, but the history of the church has genuinely been that actually we can come and ask our questions and say, what about this? This doesn't make sense. And actually, if it's true, as we do that, we will come to a conviction about that. And so our organization, what I do is go around and just ask, look at questions together with people. I myself have become convinced by the truth of the central Christian claims about who Jesus is and what that means for us. But I love thinking, and I have definitely had a long journey of doubting and asking tough questions. And so I really love that. And hopefully tonight is a night where even, I know it's obviously just you and me talking, but my hope is that anyone listening in, you can always have the dialogue with us. And, you know, if something I say, you're like, no, that doesn't make sense because of this, like write that down. And I just hope that conversation develops and continues. And ultimately, yeah, if the whole Christian story is true, then that's, to me, so exciting. And so I love getting to do what I do, and particularly just getting to meet people and hear different questions from different angles, different cultures. And yeah.
Amazing.
Snapshot.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. And so for those who are watching, over the next about 45 minutes, I'm going to be asking Lara a bunch of questions, particularly around this topic, Lara. Is the Bible pro-women? Which is a really, well, it's always a really relevant question. But it's also a question, I guess, just not just around, you know, is Christianity true, but is it even good? And so obviously you've said you're a Christian, and you travel around talking about Jesus and big questions, and you're convinced that it's true. So there's obviously, you must think that the Bible is pro-women, either that, or, you know, you've decided it isn't, and despite that fact, you're just going to go with it, which I really don't believe, knowing you.
Living in some kind of cognitive dissonance.
so yeah, I mean, let's dig into this question then, because I mean, first of all, would you say the Bible is pro-women? Yes or no?
We can just end it there.
Yeah.
So I've thought about that question a lot, and as you say, it definitely has been something that's been a very personal question to me. And the answer for me has kind of been this, if I can say it this way, I've become absolutely convinced that the God of the Bible is pro-women. However, the Bible is a faithful narrative. I think it's a very true narrative of human history. And human history is littered with all manner of evils, of, you know, all the sides, patricide, infanticide, all the murder, all the terrible things that human beings do to one another, and certainly sexism is not spared. The Bible is full of, we see sexism all the way through, both in the characters' lives and in the way societies are set up. Obviously, we can talk about how it is that I can still believe that the God of the Bible is against all of that. And yet the Bible itself does describe and is writing about people who are living in times where that is very much the case. But that's what I would say. The Bible contains much sexism, just like it contains stories of murder and all sorts of terrible things that humans do to one another. But all the way through, there is this incredible thread right from the beginning, from Genesis, in how we are given the picture of how God created humanity to exist prior to there being any problems. And we get a picture of what that ideal was. And then all the way through to the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, where again we're given a picture of what is going to be when God brings restoration to all things. We're given, in a way, prior to any of the mess that we currently live in the world. This is the Christian story, that God made us without any of that, and that he is going to restore us to that. And those two images, right, the beginning and the end of the Bible, are beautiful images of equality. And then throughout in the middle part where there's a mess, that's where it can become more confusing. And we can talk about that, but how God interacts with that.
Yeah. So you mentioned, so I guess kind of saying there that there's definitely is a lot of sexism in the Bible, because the Bible is talking about human history, and humans are fairly messed up in some ways, you could say. And you mentioned Genesis, and I'm glad you did, because I want to kind of dive in. First book of the Bible, and you're saying kind of human beings can be sexist, but so I once heard someone say that they started reading the Bible from the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2. They got to chapter 3, and God seems to kind of curse the first woman, Eve. So how can a woman or anyone read that and say that the Bible and God is pro-women when curses her, chapter 3?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Genesis is a fascinating book. I mean, maybe the first thing to say that is helpful as well is that the kind of literature that Genesis is there's a lot of literary form being used. So many, I would say most Christian scholars that I know of see the accounts in Genesis 1 and 2 of the creation as being true in the essence of what they're saying, but they're written in a poetic style. And that's just helpful as well. It's communicating something very true, but some of the aspects of it are couched in metaphor and in literary form. But within this, I think what I have found phenomenal and so beautiful, even actually as I was preparing for this and reading it again, I found myself just kind of really captured by the image that it very clearly is giving us grounds for morality and for human dignity in a way that, again, is hard to find for example, in an atheistic framework. Genesis gives us a grounding for human value in that it says very clearly that God created humanity, that is an absolute truth that Genesis is telling us, that he created humanity. And what's fascinating is it says that he created male and female in his likeness, in his image. Male and female, he created them. And there's no distinction in value there. That is made absolutely clear. And in fact, scholars have also noted that if you compare this account to, for example, the ones that we have in the other sort of ancient Near East accounts coming out of Mesopotamia, like the Akkadian account, for example, it shows us a God that is absolutely making no distinction, no hierarchical distinction between male and female. And in fact, he then goes on in Genesis 1:27 to tell them that together they need to go and have a co-dominion over the earth. So together, male and female are given rulership, and it's meant to be like a benevolent rulership, a care for the earth, not that they're just there to extort from the earth, but like God cares for them, they are then to care for the earth. And there's this incredible image of men and women together working side by side in authority and strength, in equal strength. So that's a very beautiful image right at the beginning. We could obviously talk about Genesis 2 is a secondary account, where, I mean, I don't know if that's something you want us to talk about, but there have been some questions there. People might have heard of, for example, questions coming out. It says very clearly that Adam was created first. Some questions have come up. Does that show that he was in some way more important or superior to women? There's some other things that people have asked, for example, when it says it says, and again, it is like metaphorical language, but it says Eve was made out of Adam's rib. And that's been a question. Is she sort of just, does she have sort of derivative value just as as in he's the primary one. And again, people have asked, because then the word that then is used to describe her is that she's, and the King James has used this old-fashioned phrase, a helpmeet, or other translations have said that she's a helper, and it conjures up images of sort of, Santa's little helper, or even we might even have in our minds, because of current affairs, like the help, that idea of someone who's in servitude or subservience. So there are questions there, which I could talk to if you're interested. But it's just, in fact, maybe because since I brought them up, I might as well quickly just talk. And then I'll get to the curse, which is what you actually asked about. But so in Genesis 2, so again, the question of, is Adam in some way primary or superior to Eve because he was created first? Just again, very quickly, that has been an idea that the church has punted at times. But again, major scholarship has pointed out, if you're trying to say that Adam is superior just because of he was created before that, then you do also then have to say, well, then the animals are superior to Adam and the plants are superior to the animals. And I mean, it basically is kind of making that argument, which does make sense. In fact, it seems to make more sense that Eve is actually, and this is what the story itself sort of says, she's like the pinnacle of creation. And the fact that she's taken out of him, again, that argument doesn't really make sense to say that would mean that she's inferior. If you think of Adam being made from the clay, from the ground, the clay is not more important or superior to Adam. And again, it's made very clear that it's God that makes Adam. That's what invests him with value. He breathes his life into him. And then equally, there's and this is again what we don't see in other ancient Near East accounts, a separate, equally valuable, separate creation by God of women. That again is unique to the Hebrew Bible, where he then breathes life into her. And just in case people think, oh, Adam was kind of like in some superior way co-creating Eve with God, no, the Bible makes it clear he was fast asleep doing nothing. He was not involved in that process. But and many people have noted the symbolism of the rib, that it wasn't somehow the head or the foot, but that there's this image of her being beside him, and that there's this, and then the language, so that word helper is a connector in the Hebrew, is the word ezer does mean helper, but in fact I think there's about 30 usages of this word in the Old Testament, 16 of which refer to God. And and there's Psalm, I think I've written them somewhere, Psalm, just some examples, like God is Israel's hope. We wait and hope for the Lord. He is our help and shield. Psalm 33, Exodus 18, God is my helper. Deuteronomy 33:7 asks God to be Judah's help. So that same word ezer is referring to God. So if anything, it's a sort of superior, like, oh, let me help you. Adam's sort of crying out, help, help, and Eve comes to his help. So if anything, it's that. However, then the next word goes on to make it very clear that she's not superior to him. They are completely, the connector means like opposite. It's almost like a puzzle piece, that she is totally bringing a complementary gift, and together they are revealing something of who God is. And it's interesting, again, the plurality. Christians believe in a Trinitarian God. Let us make let us make man, and that word man, Adam, actually just means humankind. So unhelpfully translated man, but it just means humankind in our image, male and female. And together they reflect God, and the emphasis seems to be on diversity. And again, this feels important for me in this cultural moment where the church has failed in the past to recognize this absolute primacy in right at the beginning of its own text, to say that God is a God who values diversity. He is not a God of homogeneity or homogeneousness. I can't remember what the word is. Homogeneousness is not
homogeneity.
Right, and God himself is united in diversity in three persons, in the Godhead, in one being, and that this is something beautiful for us to capture, and we need to embrace this to understand who God is. So that seems to be something inherent in the text. Then Genesis 3, so suddenly again, now getting to what you asked about, there is what we see as the fall. This is again incredibly important in Christian theology. Men and women together, equally, both of them, given the dignity of freedom of choice relationally, that God does not force on anyone. and he will not. And that is held up as, even though it's going to have terrible consequences, it is still so important. And, you know, I just think even now we need to keep remembering this in our society, you know, as Christians, to remember freedom of belief, freedom of choice is absolutely held up as incredibly important. We should never force, even subtly, and I hope nothing in this conversation would ever convey that we're subtly trying to manipulate or force people into belief, that is to override the soul. We need to come to our decisions out of conviction that they're true and right, and that God gives us that absolute dignity, even though there are going to be big consequences. And that's what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil symbolizes in the Garden of Eden, a genuine choice to not trust and live in relationship with God. And Adam and Eve both separately make that choice. As a result, Genesis 3 describes what is then known as the curse, which is, again, theologians have thought is that it's better described as the consequences of that choice. There is a curse in the same way that there is in whenever we choose against, you know, Christians, that story is saying that God is the source of all goodness. And whenever we choose against that in all of our lives, we know that there are consequences. And Genesis 3 is just a description of the consequences of that. And we see God saying that there will be consequences for men and consequences for women. So it's for both men and women. And it's incredibly sad and heartbreaking. And yet again, you know, even just, you know, popular psychology does actually talk about, even in relationships with even parents and children, it's actually not right. It's not healthy to come in and shield children or people from the consequences of their own free choices. That's actually an unhealthy pattern to interact with. And the Bible shows God not doing that and saying there are going to be consequences which you will feel. And yet, just like any loving parent or like any loving person, he doesn't leave them. He is there, and he journeys now with humanity and with a plan to make an option out, a rescue option for anyone who wants it. And that's obviously, I'm going now towards the story of Jesus. And the Old Testament is the whole build up to that. And then ultimately a day when sin is no longer just defeated, as Christians believe it was on the cross, that evil is actually defeated, the power of it, but one day the presence of it as well, and in the new creation. And we have that to look forward to. But in the meantime, we're experiencing still the consequences of Genesis 3. I hope that was very long. I promise not to make all my answers that long.
No, it's great. It's great. I'm thank you. It's really helpful, and I'm loving it. I guess what it seems like as you read through the Old Testament of the Bible, so the first half, I guess you could say, of the Bible, that women are second-class citizens. Men are usually the focal point. Wouldn't you say? I mean,
yeah. No, absolutely, and that does link back to the what's described in Genesis 3. And one of the consequences of this break of relationship in honesty and goodness, you know, again, Genesis talks about how prior to the fall, that break of relationship with God, it says they were naked and unashamed. There was a sense of they rejoiced in them, both in themselves and in each other. And there was this beautiful receiving of one another in all their differences. And I sort of just love the celebration of the body and sex in Genesis, and the glory of that, and the beauty of that intimacy. To me, that's so important, because intimacy to me is at the heart of life, and I love that the Bible describes that. And then it says, as soon as that break came in, straight away what we see is they're covering themselves up. We see them hiding both from one another and from God. And then as that develops, as things begin to unravel, that also develops into this dominating power dynamic. The Bible describes that in Genesis 3, that a man will dominate over a woman, and a woman's desire will be to then counter-dominate over him, is at least one theological interpretation of what is going on there in Genesis 3. And certainly that's what we see. Then from that moment on, if you read from Genesis 3 onwards, the Bible describes, and you know, even these last few weeks, my own reflections on humanity once again is how hard it is for us to let go of power, how much society after society in human history it's just, I mean, history is literally a story of domination and counter-domination and subjugation. And this is human history, and this is exactly what the Bible's describing. And it describes this battle that's going to go on between men and women. And sadly, we enter in, you know, the Old Testament text at a time in history where women are subjugated in terrible ways, and that is, again, the Bible describes wrong. That is not how it was meant to be. Even though the very people of God are now, that's us too, the church, everyone, we're all part of this dynamic where we are selfish and fearful and prideful, and that these things are happening. And so we see this, and it's described, and I love that the Bible's not ever sugarcoating it. It describes these unequal relationships. I mean, I don't know how much detail I want to go into. I was studying up on it again just in advance of this, you know, the examples of what you've asked, and if people are interested, you know, it's the prisoner of war, like women being taken captive, so sort of booty, war booty, the purity laws, which seem to be more strict for women. Is that showing that they were less pure, and, you know, that kind of thing, or even rape, the way rape is described? There's one particular law that people sometimes look at, where women who've been raped, the man who rapes her is then required by law to marry her, and, you know, questions have come, well, that seems horrendous for women, or even just polygamy was rampant, and again, that just seems that women were just being used by men. These are very legitimate questions. I've just realized I've prepared way too much because we're only on questions. I've got things to say on all of those. I guess I would just encourage you, if you're interested, that's Exodus 22, Deuteronomy 20 to 22, and Leviticus 18 describe some of these things. I would just encourage you to do some study around that. There are a few things that are really fascinating to study. As I have studied, I have actually been incredibly amazed at how the laws that God gives to his people are all the time actually going into a culture that is incredibly subjugating of women, and saying to his people, you need to be less so. Now, what he's not doing is somehow brainwashing them and making them all perfect and saying, right, this is my law, and I'm going to now force you to be a group of people who always get it right and do it right. No, he still highly regards and respects the integrity of their freedom. But now what he's saying is, you are like the people. I'm going to take this people group to use as an example to show the world what I'm like. And he takes the people of Israel and he gives them his laws. And all the way through, what we see is they are taking them out of the culture that we see again in the ancient Near East, where women were incredibly treated terribly. And at each point, he says, you're not to be like that. For example, with the rape laws at the time, the people of Israel, just like in the cultures around in like ancient Mesopotamia, if you were raped, that was just, you were then unable to be married. That was like you were now impure. And God is saying, that actually, he said, if you have raped a woman, it is now your responsibility to make sure that she is cared for. But bearing in mind, this is a culture where to not be married that was how you were protected as a woman. And so that's just one example. And just also on that example, as a matter of interest, the woman and her family were allowed to say no, she didn't want to marry him, but the onus was on that man to make sure that he offered that protection for her, because now she was sort of spoiled goods according to how culture was. But all of these laws, and I could say how each one of those examples I just gave is God saying, this is what's happening in culture. I want you to put in protections, and there are basically ways of taking them from here to here. And there's a concept that I find really helpful in theology called progressive revelation. We see there are 5 covenants in the Old Testament. Each one, we see God revealing more of his nature, more of his holiness, more of his goodness, and how that impacts on how we should, once we understand who he is and what is good and what is evil, how then that impacts on how we treat one another. And all the way through the Bible and its laws, it's like taking us from here to here to here to here. And sometimes I could think, well, why doesn't God just get rid of us if we're like doing these terrible things? But I think to myself, look at us now, even as the church, as people in our society. The Black Lives Matter movement has been brought up to our attention. We like to think of ourselves as these very enlightened people, but we have all lived in a society where our Black and friends from other minority ethnic groupings are telling us, no, you haven't noticed the ways in which your blindness has right. Kept you from seeing how we are still being subjugated through systemic things in society. And we've lived without fully recognizing this until now. We are trying to, and I think that's just to say that all of us are on a journey of really moving forward, and that's how I see the Bible's ethics working. Sorry, maybe I'll leave it there, Callum. I'm going to have to get my answer shorter. I'm going to keep trying.
No, Lara, we're going to have you come back to unpick some more of these aspects, but it's super helpful. I'm really enjoying this. I want to ask you, you mentioned Jesus. We've been talking about kind of the first half of the Bible, but I mean, Christianity is about Jesus Christ. And you mentioned him. So, I mean, what about him? I mean, why doesn't he have female disciples? If God, values women equally, he seems to be still in that culture, I guess you could say.
Absolutely, no, and I think that's such a brilliant question. As I was saying, the Old Testament, the whole way through, is promising us that. So God is revealing more and more of himself. I kind of like to think of it as even like a dating relationship, where someone is showing more and more of who they are over time. In some ways, it's not helpful, even if you went on a date with someone and they were like, this is me, and they literally tell you their entire history or tell you every aspect of their character. In some ways, you want to get to know them. That's kind of how I see the Old Testament. God is wooing humanity, and also bearing in mind, we can have hard hearts. If we, and I know I have so many times had a hard heart towards what I really, really should hear, what's really good for me to hear. And actually someone just telling me everything I should think and believe isn't helpful, but someone walking with me and showing me, and that's kind of what the Old Testament is. But all the time we're told there's this progressive revelation of who God is, but he is going to come and there is going to be the full revelation of who he is. And the book of Colossians, for example, tells us that in Christ, we see the fullness of God. That if anyone wants to know, if you have any inkling that the God of the Bible might in fact be the true God, creator of the universe, if you think that might be true, then it's worth looking at Jesus, because the Bible says that he is the revelation of God. And so we're told this revelation is coming. He's coming. And then 2,000 years ago, Jesus comes to earth, and Christians believe he is God incarnate. Again, it's fascinating though, because still, if that's true, what does that reveal to us about the kind of God he is? Again, he's not forcing us to accept him. People have often said, why is it it's such an obscure way to come? And the Bible says, yes, that is exactly how God meant for it to be, because actually the message was going to get out through the normal channels that things do when something amazing and true has happened, rather than an imposition. And Jesus comes not to impose God on everyone, but to show with his love the kind of amazing God, who God is, someone who offers himself, never imposing himself. And so Jesus comes, and as you say now on this question, so if Jesus is the full revelation of God, how does he treat women? Again, what's fascinating to me is he doesn't come and kind of hate and kill anyone who's misogynist. It's interesting. Sometimes we want that. And even his disciples wanted him to do that. They wanted him to be violent against everything that was wrong. And Jesus isn't like that. And the God of the Bible isn't like that. But what he does do is he comes and he shows them what God is like. So just some examples of who Jesus is. So in a culture, it's interesting, again, scholars have noted that actually in New Testament times, women were treated far worse than they were actually even in times of ancient Israel, because they'd been influenced by the Greek and Roman cultures, which were incredibly denigrating of women. And now that had come and flowing into the Israelite and Jewish culture of the time. Jesus comes and he stands against it. He just is different. Jesus has female friends. To get straight to your question now, so I don't beat around the bush too much. Jesus did have female disciples, and this was shocking for the time. So, for example, in Matthew, let me just make sure I've got my right verses here. Oh, sorry, I didn't. Oh, I thought I'd written that down. It's Matthew 25, I think, where Jesus points to a group of people and he says, "These are my disciples," and he refers to them in the male and the female. And again, theologians have noted that this would have been absolutely, you would never do that in that time. You would never point to a group of men and say and use the female and male to describe them. So it's very clear this is a group of men and women, and he says, "These are my disciples." Then again, totally counterculturally, we see him receiving women. He has women as friends. So in Luke 8, we're told that he traveled from town to town and that he took with him Mary, Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Chusa, and Susanna, and many others. And in fact, that they actually supported his ministry financially. And it's just interesting. Again, that was, if you look at the culture, Ben Sirach of Jerusalem writes, we see a sharp contrast because he writes, "Bad temper, insolence, and shame hold sway where the wife supports her husband." So whenever there was a woman financially supporting a man, it was like a no-no. Jesus happily received support from women. We see in Luke 10, Mary, and we're told that there's a construction, a phrase that's used, and this is Luke 10:38, Mary sat at the feet of Jesus. That was a well-known phrase to denote a disciple sitting at the feet of the rabbi. It's used in Acts 22, describing Paul under the training of Gamaliel, the foremost writer of the New Testament. It's a very well-known phrase. This is literally saying she was a disciple. It's interesting, her sister Martha is all distressed at the fact that Mary, she thinks, she should be in the kitchen, helping where the women should be, helping prepare the food. Meanwhile, she's just sitting there learning from Jesus. And Martha, the sister, gets so upset. And Jesus goes to Martha and he says, "Martha, Martha, I see that you are distressed about many things." And he says, "Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her." This direct encouragement of Mary to learn. Also, just on that note, it's really interesting. Disciples were only taught, it was very clearly understood that you learned in order to teach. So that's interesting to note as well. So if Mary was being taught and other women were being taught, there would be a strong assumption that they would be that they would then go on to teach. Oh, there's so much to say here. Jesus, again, uniquely teaches. It's clear that he's teaching women because in so many of his parables and his teachings, he uses examples. He goes from the world of women to the world of men, from the world of men to the world of women. For example, when he says, no one lighting a lamp will put it under a basket. And then he says, in the same way, if you on the city wall and you're lighting, and women were the ones who would always light the lamps in the home, men were always culturally the ones who lit the lights on the city wall. So he's clearly comparing, trying to make sure he's teaching the women alongside the men, bringing them in, making it relevant to both of them. He does the same thing where he's talking about the wineskins, and it was men had the job of filling the wineskins, and he says you wouldn't put I always get this wrong around, new wine in old wineskins. And then he says, likewise, you wouldn't sew an old patch of garment onto a new patch. Women were the ones who sewed garments. Men were the ones who did that, who did the wineskins. Oh, there's so many other examples where he talks about a woman, he talks about a shepherd having lost a sheep, and then he turns and says, a woman who's lost a coin. He's always including women. These are things that's easy for us to miss, but they would have been incredibly countercultural at the time. John 4, the disciples were told, clearly tell us that it says, his disciples, they freely acknowledge it as they write these accounts, that they were surprised to find him talking to a woman. He was willing to face the shame of, it wasn't acceptable to talk to a woman on your own. How often, even in our churches, are men still nervous to be seen because it might have the wrong connotations? I love that. Jesus, yes, he was pure in the way he interacted with women, and he wasn't trying to get something from them, but he didn't let the stereotypes stop him from engaging and being loving and seeing women as equal and treating them as such. Also, she was seen as a woman who was, she was out in the middle of the day. No woman collected water in the heat of the day. That we know that was because she must have been shunned by society. Jesus didn't let that stop him. Similarly, in Luke 7, again, a woman who was known as a sinner comes in. She obviously felt so loved by Jesus because we're told she just literally pours out her love on him, even in a physical way. Again, how many of our church leaders would accept that? and wouldn't think, oh, what are people going to think? This sinner woman. Jesus says, no, she welcomes her in, and he said, because she's been forgiven much, she loves much, and he challenges the leaders. So Jesus is constantly doing these things. So yes, he does only have 12 male disciples, and you could ask, well, why doesn't he include women in that official list? I don't know the answer, other than to say that to me it fits with the narrative of Jesus has a particular mission in mind, and what he's doing is sowing seeds all the way through of what his kingdom is really like. There are things he could have done all the way through in his 3 years of ministry, which meant he would have been killed straight away. Perhaps having women in the official 12 would have been one of those things. He was already pushing all the boundaries by allowing, clearly loving and teaching women. Other people have noted similarly, though, that, he also, he only had Jewish men. That doesn't mean the Bible's very clear. It's for all nations. So I would say that everything that Jesus does and the way he teaches and includes women has to lead me to see how much he venerates and respects women. And yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, no, super helpful. And I want to push back there. Okay, so Jesus sounds amazing and radical in his day. But then there's this guy named Paul you mentioned, and he wrote a lot of the New Testament. And thinking about time as well here, and combined, he writes that women should be silent in church, and he also talks about how wives should submit to their husbands in another part. Maybe Jesus was, but did Paul hijack the message? I mean, this seems like, that women and men are not equal.
Yeah. Okay. Let me try and be super quick here. What Jesus begins, the early church picks up. We're told in Acts that women were dragged into the streets. And in church history, that women were dragged into the streets when the church started coming under persecution. Even today in the Middle East, Ken Bailey, one of a really useful theologian on all these things, says only the leaders of movements are dragged into the streets. So that's an interesting thing to note, that women, it really heavily suggests that women are leaders. And on top of that, we have so many examples of women as leaders in the church. Phoebe, Junia, there's obviously some questions of that, but won't get into that. But Priscilla teaching Apollos, one of the foremost preachers in the New Testament, she teaches him and corrects his theology. Many other examples, Tabitha in the New Testament. In fact, 1/3 of the list of people that Paul says that need to be honored are women. And so, I mean, that's clear that he's always referencing them. And so, the New Testament goes on to include many women leaders throughout the movement. But what are these few texts saying? And very quickly to start with Ephesians, and I'll talk to the one you mentioned in Corinthians. In Ephesians, where it's talking about how wives and husbands should relate to each other, the first thing to note is, so again, I would say, Christianity and the way God seems to interact is to get into culture, not to be so removed and so that it can't almost speak to where culture is at the moment. What Paul seems to be doing is entering into the culture in writing to the people in Ephesus, and he's saying, look, in a culture, in the Roman culture in general, there were multiple codes of how women should, what their duties are towards their husbands and in the home. Many theologians and historians have noted that this was incredibly countercultural. It would have been very shocking. The first thing that they would have been shocked by the fact that Paul is actually writing a whole code for the men. That was totally countercultural. Not only that, but he tells them that actually the onus should be on them to lay their lives down. He's basically trying to make a point that up until now, it's always been what the women's duties are to the men, and he's saying, no, men, I want you to honor your wives, and you have a duty of care. Another thing just to notice is, Ephesus was the 3rd largest city after, I think, Rome, Alexandria, then Ephesus, something like 200,000 people. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was there, this incredible, temple to the goddess Artemis, which I think is about the size of a football, 1.5 football pitches, so it's huge, and roughly 7 stories up, and absolutely much bigger than the Athenian Parthenon, so huge place. And it was basically a place where women ruled. This kind of ruling slave class of women, and any men who worked there had to be castrated. And actually there was a very interesting dynamic of women in the city. I won't go into it too much, but it does also seem that whenever either First Timothy and Ephesians writing into this context, there was also, I mean, and you can imagine this kind of massive powerful force. By far the most powerful force in the city was this worship of Artemis, or Diana, the Diana cult in the Roman parlance. But essentially that, and it was a very kind of dominating, or actually female dominating culture. And the beginning of Ephesians, of First Timothy, Paul's trying to encourage Timothy not to be disheartened. He's feeling so dominated, actually. And it just seems that basically what Paul is saying here is it seems that this is a very particular context where women were being quite domineering. This is one interpretation. Other people have other ones. But either way, I think it's hard to think historically that wasn't the case given the culture of what was going on. And he seems to be saying, look, mutual submission is what the Bible is about. It's not dominating of one or the other. To quickly speak to the Corinthian passage you mentioned, that is actually quite an easy one it's hard, it's easy to misunderstand if you read it quickly. But actually, if you look at the text, what Paul is saying, again, the Corinthian culture is slightly different. They're all about kind of like a hyper spirituality that actually sometimes manifested in such a way that it forgot to care for one another wasn't at a premium. Actually being hyper spiritual was, and he's actually countering that. And Paul's saying, look, spirituality is wonderful. Having kind of spiritual experiences is wonderful. Powerful prayers are wonderful. He said, but never at the expense of people. And it seemed that there were kind of prophets and people who were praying in certain ways, and then women who were not understanding, again, at the time, because women were so subjugated, they were often at home and they learned a little dialect from the local area, whereas Greek would have been the lingua franca and would have been the language that they would have spoken in those meetings. And again, this is showing how progressive it was. Women were actually learning alongside men. But it seems that because there was a language barrier, the women were sort of talking and asking for clarifications whilst everything was going on. And to all these 3 groups, Paul says, I don't want you to be kind of being chaotic. To the prophets, he says, instead, I want you to be silent. To the ones praying in these certain very loud and chaotic ways, again, he's saying, look, I don't want you to pray in a chaotic way. I want you to be silent. To the women who are constantly asking for clarifications, rather ask your husbands when you get home to explain what the Greek meant. I want you to be silent. So basically, I hope that's helpful, but the context is don't cause a disruption to the whole group. And he's saying it to a variety of different people. I myself, my first struggle with this issue was actually as I read 1 Corinthians 11, which you didn't ask me about. But I just want to quickly say to that actually I knelt down and prayed when I first read that, because I started crying because of how much I was so afraid that is the God of the Bible sexist, because in 1 Corinthians 11, it talks about how, again, different things that I didn't understand, but I felt like God really spoke to me through verse 13 and said, it says, judge for yourselves. And again, the context of what he's talking about is saying, like, in this context, what is the most honoring and loving way to interact with your fellow congregants? And judge for yourselves. And the rules might change, but at the heart of it, how are you interacting? And Jesus said this, to sum up the whole law is to say that it's love for God and love for one another. And so all of these texts are between husbands and wives, people in the church. The real question is, as men and women, are you loving each other the way God initially designed you to? And now, as those who have come back into relationship with him, you have a mandate to learn what it is to love again.
Amazing. Lara, we're getting near the end, but I want to kind of summing up in a sense, why as a woman are you a Christian? Why stay a Christian in a sense? Why are you a Christian?
I mentioned that time I was actually 16 years old when that happened. I had felt really hurt by the church. As a woman, I hadn't felt that I was equally valued. I think that was partly the church, that was partly culture. And I really felt, I actually, at that point, I'd become convinced that I was pretty sure that Jesus was who he said he was. I'd read about him. I'd questioned different things about the evidence around his resurrection, his life, even who he was. I'd become convinced of that. But actually, despite that, the question around his moral goodness and who he was to me, again, even despite the fact that I'd become convinced of that fact, it almost brought it all up again, like just because I wasn't convinced he was good. And like I think you said in the beginning, and to me, and this is why I said to me it's so important that we speak about the importance and the welcome that I really believe God gives each one of us to bring our deepest doubts and fears before him. Because I still remember that day when I came home into my bedroom and I'd been avoiding these texts. I'd read my Bible and I'd just flip over 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Timothy 2, 1 Corinthians 14, just didn't want to read them. And I thought, no, I have to face this. And I opened up my Bible to 1 Corinthians 7, I knelt down and I started to cry and I said, God, I have not felt equally valuable in this world. And I'm terrified to find out that actually, if there is a God, that he doesn't either. And that was so amazing to me that he spoke to, like, I literally was almost like an audible voice. It wasn't, but it was so clear in my head. Look at verse 13, which was then judge for yourselves. That's just one example. Throughout my life, there have been the most incredible times of encounter with God, but they've only ever happened when I've been willing to be very real. I love that this whole thing we're having is called Real Lives. To me, Christianity is about being real. If I'm willing to be real, my personal experience is God has met me in that. Not always straight away, but he has met me, and that's why. And I still, the more I learn about Jesus, the more I fall in love with him. Even today, actually, while I was preparing, at one point, I just stopped, I closed the book, and I just put my hands up, and I just felt like I wanted to worship. I was reading about this God that I love and I know loves me. And so, there's so much I could say, but maybe end there.
Yeah. And thank you. And what would you say? And in some ways, like, we need to have you back. We need to continue this conversation. There's so much, and I'm loving this. But I mean, you mentioned kind of your own ways you've been hurt. And I think that probably is true for a number of people watching this as well. Women in particular, maybe, who've been hurt by Christians, by churches. What would you say to them? Because you still kind of attend a church, you're still following, you're still trusting Jesus. Like, what would you say to them? Why give Jesus a chance, and why give church a chance? Maybe could we just follow Jesus and just that, not the church? Seems kind of hard.
It's a really important question, and it's a really deep question on my heart, even given this cultural moment we're living in, because I think God grieves, and Jesus' harshest words were for religious leaders, because he said, you are the ones who are communicating who God is. And when the church fails to communicate the absolute value that God places on each person, especially those who have been downtrodden or pushed aside, it grieves God's heart. And in fact, that phrase, God's wrath, is most often used to describe the anger he feels towards his own people, who are meant to be those who are telling the world of his love, and that his anger burns because of the value that he has for each person, and how he wants us to know that, wants us all to know that. And so the church can be a tough place, because it's a place where you might want to come and hope to find that, but actually the church is itself full of broken people. And I grieve for the ways in which I myself have I'm sure have not valued people, just so many people in society who have been not treated in the way they should. And how many times have I walked past and just wanted to talk to people I want to talk to at church, rather than being like God and said, actually, that person's feeling maybe not like they fit in. What would God do? He would go talk to them. Like, I include myself in this. But I think, we are all so much works in progress. And I just thank God that he's so gracious to me for when I fail to do that. But I felt like on this issue, God spoke to me and said, Lara, the most important thing is that you know in your heart how I see you. Because actually the truth is, we're never going to get the whole world to see everything the way they should and we should. You know, we're all going to be on a journey throughout our lives. And I guess if we're always looking for affirmation from everyone else, even though ideally we should have it, and church leaders and especially should be working the hardest to do that and be the most humble and trying to learn to do that, despite that, I felt God saying the church is always going to let you down. I want you to come to me, and I want you to know your intrinsic value and worth that I give you, and let there be freedom there. Freedom to be strong in and of yourself, even in the face of other people not valuing you. And you know, as I've looked to Jesus, that has been what I have found. So it's definitely not easy, but I would say with God in prayer.
Yeah. And would you recommend trying church, or would you say no, just go with Jesus?
No, that's a great question.
I say this with trepidation, as this is above our church-real lives, but
yeah. No, I mean, I absolutely would. I have been someone who has felt the pain of the church not being what it should. And I would say the people who probably struggle the most with church are people who have a bit of like a, you know, I think different personalities. I'm quite idealistic, and I can get so disappointed and because of how much I long for the good. And that's a good thing. God's made different people like that. But I think if you are like that, to recognize that tendency, and that probably means you are more sensitive and you are more likely to get hurt. And that's tough, but actually within the church there hopefully is space to talk about that, pray together. And I actually think that the most exciting thing is to be part of a group of people who are on a journey together of humility. I would say I would look for a church where you sense humility in the leadership, in the people, not a kind of, oh, we're so terrible, we'll keep quiet, we can have, no, like a confidence, but also a genuine humility. That is, and I really believe that, and I have in my own life, I've never left the church because I still have found it to be, despite all its brokenness, the most beautiful place. And even if you have been hurt, I mean, please, I'm sure Callum, you'd be willing to talk to anyone on this call who's felt that way. I know I would be. But there are amazing. It is amazing to be with a group of people who are in love with Jesus and who want to be like him. And I'm still so excited about the church. I think it's Jesus loved the church. He died for us, and even though we're so broken, he's never told us that we're not good enough, and he's going to forget about us, which is amazing.
Oh, thank you so much, Lara. We have like 2 minutes left, and I want to ask you. This is me. It's kind of mean. Someone's asking you these big questions with so little time, but there's a lot of people watching right now, and that will watch after it's live as well. And some might be feeling really skeptical about all this. Some might be like kind of like, this Jesus you talk about is intriguing to me. I'm still a bit on the fence. And there's some people who are like, this sounds amazing to me. I want this. I want what you have. What would you say? What would be your final piece of advice as we close real lives? To these kind of three groups.
I think I would say a few things. I first say thank you so much for listening. Thank you for coming and you know giving me a hearing in this. I really believe in the power of prayer, and to anyone who, whatever category that Callum just described, someone once said, actually, that's someone once said this, well, you can't perform any scientific tests to find out whether or not Christianity is true. And one of my friends, Vince Vitale, said, well, actually, he didn't think that's true because he was an atheist and he prayed. And in fact, that he was like, God, if you're real, I want you to convince me. I want to be open to that. And he was like, that is a test you can perform. And the Bible says like that. If that is genuinely, if you genuinely want to know what's true, if you seek and you seek with all your heart, the Bible is absolutely clear that you will find God. So if that is in any way something that you want or you think might be true, why not even now, straight after this call, with no one else around, go close in the privacy of your own room, close your door, in however you feel comfortable, talk to God. If he is real, he's listening, and say, please. And I have had so many friends who have become Christians because that is what they did. And then the remarkable different things that happened in their lives as a result of praying that prayer. So be ready if you're going to pray that prayer. I mean, obviously, I believe God's actually real, so something is going to happen. If you find that, as I'm saying that, something in you is like, no, I don't want to pray that prayer, I would just be intrigued by that, and maybe write down in your, something's made you want to listen to this talk, and something's intriguing you. Why don't you write down what it is that would even stop you from wanting to pray that prayer? Like, is there something in you that thinks, actually, I don't want Christianity to be true? I think it's just a fascinating exercise to kind of, even just to understand yourself a bit better. Why is that? What do I want to be true? Why? And engage in thinking. I think the worst thing we can do as humans is kind of close our eyes to reality and just try and kind of get through life as fast as possible, just try and have as much fun as possible. I actually think the depth of life is all about getting into what's really going on and here, and not being afraid of that, and that there's really beauty at the heart of life, and that's to be explored and discovered, even though there might be pain there too. So I would just encourage, I guess that maybe that's where I end, is talking about this is real lives, and just to be as real in life as possible. And then also just reach out to people. If you have a Christian friend and you want to talk to them about it, see if I bet you they would be really keen to talk. Again, please, if you ever want to contact a Christian and you're not sure who, I would be more than willing to talk to anyone who wanted to talk. I know Callum would be too. So yeah, maybe start conversations. And then lastly, I would just say, read about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. This whole thing hinges on whether Jesus was God incarnate or not. As Paul says in the New Testament, if Jesus wasn't who he said he was, if he didn't in fact rise from the dead, which, let's be honest, is incredibly unlikely unless he was God, then this whole thing is, so Christianity is not worth pursuing unless Jesus was who he said he was. I think he's the most compelling character in all of history. So why don't you start there? Even tonight, get a cup of tea and open the Gospel of Luke, or maybe John is a good place to start, depending on if you prefer literature or history. Anyway, but yeah, that's maybe where I'll end.
Amazing. Lara, I really appreciate your time and your passion, and that you took your time to help us with these kind of thorny questions. I really appreciate it. This is normally the place where I would ask the audience to give you a round of applause, but so maybe people can as they watch on YouTube. I just want to say, as we wrap up, thank you so much for watching, those who are watching on YouTube, on Above Our Church webpage. And I really want to encourage you, like Lara said, if this is something you want to continue to investigate, why not try reading one of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus's life that we call the Gospels? Luke is the history one, John is the literature one Lara was referencing. Why not pull it up on your web browser, or if you have one, a physical copy, and give it a read and ask yourself, who is Jesus really? And why not try that kind of agnostic's prayer? God, if you're there, would you show yourself to me? It certainly can't hurt you to pray that. I'll encourage you as well, Above Our Church have services on YouTube on Sunday at 10 a.m. if you want to kind of check out and dip your toe in the water and see what it's like. And if you want to go to the webpage and on the contact page, if you want to get in touch or you want to ask questions, you have more questions you want to discuss, please do. And we do real lives throughout the year, so keep an eye out for our next one. We'd love to have you, and maybe we can have Lara back sometime. That would be great. But thank you so much for watching, and